I'll just like look over your shoulder. Yeah.
Yeah, so she's very good. Yep.
Have you taken more courses?
I've taken a bunch of courses. I don't know. But
Yeah.
I must have, but
I think I've taken it.
I haven't been there for a couple of years.
Yeah, I haven't taken it for it.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Exactly. It's good enough, I'll come.
Good evening, everyone. My name is John, and I'm the event coordinator here at McNally Robinson Booksellers. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge, of course, that the land on which we gather is Treaty 1 territory and the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Inuit, Anishinaabe, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Red River Métis. In addition, McNally Robinson Booksellers itself, of course, rests on the land once occupied by the Métis community of Worcestertown. It's delightful to see so many of you out here in person for the launch of a book that has been on our bestseller list since it hit our shelves. That is, of course, Imprinting Empire, Land and Settler Colonialism in Manitoba Newspapers by Shelisa Klassen, to which you may wildly applaud. Huge thanks to our great friends at the University of Manitoba Press for all their work and collaboration. We'll be hearing from Shelisa in just a moment, after which she will be joined in conversation by Adele Perry. Following the conversation, there'll be an opportunity for all of you folks to ask questions, so please allow those to percolate over the course of the evening. When it does come time for the questions, I'll circulate with this microphone to ensure that your questions are audible for all those who are joining us online. And I'll be back at the end to review signing procedure, which is always the most exciting part of any evening. But now I have the great pleasure of introducing tonight's participants. Your host, Adele Perry, is a settler historian of Canada, colonialism, and gender. She is currently Distinguished Professor in History and Women's and Gender Studies, Senior Fellow at St. John's College, and since 2020, Director of the Center for Human Rights Research at the University of Manitoba. Our featured guest, Shelisa Klassen, has submitted a very succinct bio indicating that she is Assistant Professor of Canadian History at the University of Regina. Please give her an enormously warm welcome.
Figured most of you knew me, so I didn't need to provide all of the details. But if you want to know more, feel free to ask for a longer bio. I'll be talking enough this evening. Okay, thank you everyone for being here. It's very exciting to be back here in Treaty 1 in Manitoba and to be celebrating my book with all of you in person and online. This has been a real labor of love, and it feels great to end this decade of research, to have it now in a form where you can all read it. I'm so grateful to the team at the UM Press who really embraced this project and helped me get over the finish line and helped me with all the things that are extra to writing the book, that design and layout and things like that I could never do. My peer reviewers gave incredibly insightful and helpful feedback, and the copy editor and everyone at UMP gave notes on manuscript and really helped polish up my words and transform them into something that feels beautifully professional. And I love the final product. I came to this research because I wanted to understand my own family history better. As a Mennonite settler, I knew the Mennonite perspective of 1870s Manitoba. A devout, pacifist, religious community was seeking land to settle and farm and to stay out of worldly affairs. And as a Canadian growing up, I had been taught the myth of a peaceful and orderly homesteading settler era in the prairie. I suspected that neither of those stories were accurately portraying the settler colonial process, and so began my research. Manitoba in the 1870s was a place under an incredibly rapid transition period from an Indigenous space into a settler colonial one. And in the newspapers from that period, we can see the settler colonial institutions and norms being created and imposed in real time. I chose to look at newspapers because they reveal so much about the politics and everyday lives of the people living in a given place, as well as the myths and ideas that the newspapermen, who were local businessmen and politicians, were trying to promote and perpetuate. What is fairly unique to Manitoba is that there were multiple newspapers actively publishing during this transition period. So I was able to learn about the same events, such as the Métis script process or land surveys, from multiple perspectives. and see how newspapers with more Métis readership would discuss these events differently from newspapers that had a more settler audience or were intended for an audience outside of Manitoba. I also examined the immigration materials produced in Manitoba, and that helped to connect the dots and demonstrate the way that newspapers were doing the same work as immigration pamphlets in selling the West to settlers and covering up the violence and crimes of colonialism. So I'm going to read a couple of passages from my book, from the opening couple of pages, and then also a passage from chapter 6, which explores how the military occupation of 1870 and 1871 left its mark on Winnipeg, and then how that was brought up again in 1873 with the arrival of the Northwest Mounted Police. So. In his 110-page immigration pamphlet, A Practical Handbook and Guide to Manitoba and the Northwest, Alexander Begg included 37 pages of newspaper quotes under the section Extracts from Local Papers and Correspondence to prove the correctness of the pamphlet. This section included excerpts from newspaper articles with and without source citations, in addition to many letters to the editor from settlers, which served as testimonials about the prosperity awaiting future immigrants to Manitoba. From commenting on the strawberries available in the market to noting that the weather was mild enough to play a cricket match in April, Begg used newspaper excerpts to prove that his immigration propaganda was factually accurate. He omitted that the newspapermen wrote the news and selected the editorials. The newspapermen who wrote the news and selected the editorials were active participants in recruiting immigrants and establishing a settler colonial order. Examining that omission is the main purpose of this book. This is a history of how land and sovereignty changed hands during a time when white settlers were establishing a system of settler colonial control over Indigenous nations. It's also a history of the role of the colonial press in facilitating and promoting immigration as part of establishing settler sovereignty over land. In Manitoba, as in many settler colonial projects, immigration was the mechanism by which the land would be taken. And this was clearly communicated in the newspapers and immigration materials. Local politics shaped the discourse around immigration and the quest for control over the land, as did local settler relationships with the Métis Nation and the Anishinaabe, Cree, and Dakota, not to mention the extensive network of kinship and trade relationships with other Indigenous peoples that impacted life in the settler colony of Manitoba. The conversations happening in Ottawa and the national newspapers were often not the same as the discussions in the local Manitoba media. They shared the goal of extending the empire across the prairie, but residents of Manitoba were intimately aware of the challenges and obstacles to this plan. This history of land and sovereignty and migration is also a personal history for me. As a settler Mennonite who can trace every branch of my family back to the Mennonites, who settled in Manitoba between 1874 and 1880. The story of the first decade of immigration to the province of Manitoba and how land changed hands is also the story of my family. As I was in the middle of this research, Manitoba's then Premier Brian Pallister described the history of settlers in Manitoba by saying, quote, "The people who came here to this country before it was a country and since didn't come here to destroy anything. They came here to build. They came to build better." This comment was, of course, followed by calls for him to educate himself about the history of Manitoba, but there's actually perhaps no better quote to explain the attitude of the settlers who moved to Manitoba during the 1870s. The settlers did come to build better, but first were incredibly intentional in tearing down and destroying the Indigenous structures and systems that they found at Red River. That destruction was at times physical, as in the case of military and mob violence, and at other times it was structural, as laws and political mechanisms were employed to delegitimize Indigenous claims to land and legitimize settler occupation. In contrast to Pallister's assertions about the lack of destruction in Manitoba's colonization by settlers, scholar Patrick Wolfe succinctly states that settler colonialism destroys to replace. In the Canadian prairie, the violence of settler colonialism persists to the present day in terms of the attitudes around land and sovereignty through what Gina Starblanket and Douglas Hunt call, quote, mythological tropes about the virtuousness of Canada's people and righteousness of its political and cultural formations. They explain that Indigenous people are subjected to tropes that, quote, function to naturalize our exclusion, immiseration, and ultimately death, end quote. The stories that immigrants told about themselves in the newspapers of Manitoba in the 1870s reveal a concerted effort to create and reinforce the mythology of the virtuous settler and immigrant. This extended to justifying the violent disputes over sovereignty and land, using the myth of virtuous settlement and land use. Travis Weissaut and Aaron Morton call this practice pioneer lies or white settler tautologies, or things that seem true by the very nature of the repetition and their logical irrefutability under settler colonialism. The pioneer lie, quote, imagines a willing Indigenous subject rather than a willful, resistant, and complex Indigenous person whose presence evokes a history that settlers no longer want to see. Newspapers and immigration literature from the 1870s promoted an optimistic view of the Canadian prairie in order to recruit immigrants while downplaying the violence and dispossession that this attempt to seize power and land from Indigenous people required. The goal of immigration discourse in the newspapers and in the promotional materials was to repeatedly assert Canadian sovereignty over Indigenous land and people until repetition and the growing settler population made that myth or lie believable. And then from chapter 6, I'll read a little bit about the arrival of the Northwest Mounted Police and the military occupation. There were people in Manitoba who publicly critiqued the military occupation, though they were often attacked in the press. Robert Cunningham, member of Parliament for Marquette and editor for the Manitoba and the Northwest Herald, who generally defended the actions of the BL government and advocated for Métis rights, was the subject of a Free Press article, which argued that he was, quote, the tool of rebels and murderers, and therefore it is that he has ever attempted to extenuate and condone treason and murder, while he makes ever so much ado about a drunken row attended with no serious consequences in which the hated Ontario volunteers happen to be implicated. That's the Red River Expeditionary Force. A week after this, Cunningham moved for copies of all correspondence which may have passed between the Dominion government and the government of Manitoba, touching the military riots of 1870 and the riotous and incendiary proceedings of the late elections, together with the murderous assault committed on Mr. Dubuque, barrister, for acting as prosecuting counsel against some of those charged with taking part in the riots, also copies of communications, which may have been received referring to the late outrages perpetuated on the Legislative Assembly of Manitoba and the Speaker thereof. He's asking for all these documents because he hopes that, quote, when the papers are brought down, steps would be taken to do away with the reign of terror under which the people of Manitoba had been placed during the last few years. He vocally called the reign of terror what it was when many of the newspapers shied away from such bold statements. In October of 1873, Cunningham's newspaper, the Manitoban, wrote that 100 men in the Northwest Mounted Police were on their way to Fort Garry, and he speculated about what this could mean for life in Manitoba. In our own little province, we have had various experiences, this is a speculation, with respect to our police. We have seen the whole police force, when it was at its largest, not only threatened, but chased like prairie chickens by a crowd of Wolseley's heroes. That's the Red River Expeditionary Force again. And their jail broken open and their prisoners taken out without having the courage to even lodge a complaint. We have seen the town of Winnipeg in the hands of a riotous mob, and we have seen our police force, when informed that in the lands of that mob, property was being destroyed and lives endangered, they were hidden away in their little office, quivering and quaking and refusing to do their duty. What the exact duties of a mounted police officer or police force are anticipated to be, we are not aware. But we trust that the men of the force who are on their way will be found to be reliable men and not composed of the material which ought to be forming part of the penitentiary. It is a bad thing for any country when the conservators of the peace are felons. Manitoba had already experienced a military-imposed mob rule, after all, a military rule that first flouted the authority of the local law enforcement and terrorized them, and then became the local law enforcement. And that's some of the exchanges that are happening in the newspaper. And I hope those excerpts shed some light on the goal of the project and sort of the nuances of putting these papers in conversation with each other. And now Adele and I are going to have a conversation.
So first, I should speak into this mic here, which has been adjusted for my height. I think I took a photo of everybody for posterity. Okay, so get ready. Look your most historical and fiercest. Everybody, okay, and then we're gonna wave. Everybody wave. Okay, excellent. Thank you. Posterity. Great. Stars. So this is such a great book. It is smart and it's sharp and it's both focused, but it speaks to really significant issues of history and also of the present for this place, Manitoba, but also connects into global histories. And what tends to happen at this moment, you spend all this time writing a book. Publishers spend all this time working with it, and then everybody wants to talk about the cover and the title. Right? This is what happens. You're like fixing footnotes in your pajamas, years and years and years. Then all of a sudden, let's talk about the cover. So, but I want to ask you, can you tell us a little bit more about both the title, like your choice of terminology and framing, the words you chose, but also the cover of the book, and also some of the visual work inside the book. And I know this brings us to the dialogue between you and your team at the University of Manitoba Press, but I just wonder if you might want to say a little bit more about those choices.
Yes. So this title came from my team. I had much more clunkier titles because this marketing is not what I do. But when we were going through sort of the themes and the ideas that I had that would become this title, we really liked the idea of Imprinting Empire, not only because this is the printing press that we're talking about, but also because when you imprint something, like you're making a mark, you're putting pressure, and then you're leaving something behind that is hard to get rid of, right? And I think that's like the legacy of this period in Manitoba in the 1870s is an incredibly, it's high pressure, it's intense, it's violent, and it leaves a mark behind. Our province for the last 150 years I think, bears the consequences of that. And whether or not we feel like there's an empire building project happening here today, it is how this province began. I think that remains behind. So that was an important part of choosing those words. And the cover, I wanted to show land, because so much about the process and both the violence and the disputes that were happening were about land. So land, open prairie sky, it sort of mimics the landscape. And you can see a little cabin, a little homestead cabin in here if you look closely. So that speaks to maybe a subtle detail. Yeah.
And within the book, if you want to show people who may have a copy of the book, but those who do not, there's some really interesting kind of visual work of the newspapers themselves.
Yes, yeah. So I asked my team if we could include newspapers in as many ways as possible because they were sort of essential to this process. So I just wanted newspapers in this book. So they were really great and came up with the idea of putting on all like the blank facing pages between the chapters. They included a newspaper article that relates to the material found within that chapter. So if you, there's some little Easter eggs as you are reading through. If you look through the articles that are here, those are often the articles that are pretty significantly cited within the following chapter. So you can take a look and see the primary sources that were informing my own analysis and my work. And every chapter. It also makes for a great bookmark to know which chapter you're going to, because you can see it from as you're flipping through very easily. So there's a practical use to it as well. It's not just pretty.
Yeah, and that is such an important point. And I was thinking about, and you touched on this in your comments a little bit, but about the particular power of talking about the 1870s and the 1880s, maybe. And this is kind of a nerdy historian question, but I figured this crowd you're sort of up for the nerdy history questions. You know, we know a lot about Manitoba at mid-19th century, and in particular about Red River. There's a great deal of kind of knowledge and enthusiasm. And then we know a lot about sort of southern Manitoba, and in particular Winnipeg, I would say post-railroad, so after the mid-1880s, and especially into the 20th century. But between those bookends, there is an enormous transfer of power and a remaking of place. And I'm wondering if you want to say a little bit more about what happens in those decades and what your particular study here sheds light on and suggests that we could learn more about this period of time where so much changes.
Yeah. I think as I hinted in my opening statements, this is a period of really intense transformation in the 1870s. At the opening of that decade, population of Red River is decidedly Indigenous. And by the time we are getting to the end of that decade and entering into the 1880s, we're seeing a sort of massive boom in settler arrival, with the railway being completed especially. And the governance of Red River and all of the like power structures have changed hands during that time. So basically this is a period where we're seeing settler colonial institutions be imposed and created in real time, and all of like the messiness of that, not only in like the actual violence, but even just like the day-to-day, like what are the laws in this place and who is enforcing the laws and whose laws are we enforcing? All of those things are sort of being worked out in real time. And then what is fairly unique to Manitoba during that time is that there's like half a dozen newspapers that are publishing throughout that entire period. So that work is not happening like secretly or like behind closed doors. It's happening, like there are newspapers weighing in on it through that entire process, which I think is helpful, because I think in some places, if the press arrives after some of those institutions have been created, they can sort of come in and say this is how it's always been, or this is normal. But because in Manitoba, we're watching the entire time, we're able to see people in real time point out, this is not working, this is a failure, this is we don't like it, and wrestle with that like duality, sort of in real time, of things that are supposed to be happening but are not happening, and the violence that is not talked about but also can't be ignored. And so I think there's a lot happening in this decade in Manitoba to make it so that by the time the settlers arrive, by the time the railway comes through, it feels more like a settler space. And we get to watch that all in the newspapers.
Thank you. There's a lot of stories here that you glean through the newspapers, and then there's the stories of the newspapers of themselves. And I was wondering if you think now at this point where you've got this book, it's going out into the world with people, what would be one or two stories, whether they're of people or of places or of moments, that you think encapsulate this big messy process that you're tracking here?
Yeah. There's one letter to the editor that has stuck with me the whole time that I was working on this project. And it's published originally, I believe, in the Globe, but then reprinted in the Free Press. But it's from a French settler in L'Atelier, Manitoba, who writes this letter lamenting that there aren't any women to marry. And so it's an appeal for French women to come to Manitoba. But in that appeal, he says it's really important that you come, because if no one comes here to marry us, settlers will be forced to rape and assault Indigenous women. But you would never let us do that. So we know that you'll come when we ask you to come. And that is just casually printed in the newspaper, and it was just like this incredible threat of violence that was just hanging over, like almost like a casual like marriage request. But I think speaks to both the gender dynamics of settler colonialism generally, which of course Adele knows a lot about, and gender is always inherent in settler colonialism, and land reproduction, that's sort of all tied in. And then also gendered violence is always inherent in settler colonialism. That's part of the process. And it stuck with me because I guess I did many times when I was doing this research, what shocked me was not so much that I didn't like know what was happening under settler colonialism, but to have it said so blatantly out in the open. That was shocking sometimes, that I didn't have to read into things. And so that story has always stuck with me as really sort of shedding light on the whole process and sort of pulling the curtain back on the violence that is underplaying all of what's happening. And then another story, it's not really, well, it's a little bit lighter, but it's not really much lighter. And it's this back and forth exchange where it's happening in the French newspaper, Le Métis, and they're trying to figure out what happened to the French clerk that used to work at the land office, and they can't figure out why no one's able to get their land claims processed in French. And for a while, they think maybe he's been sort of hidden out in the back office, and they're not sure. And then they think maybe he's been sent back to Ottawa. But what's happening there is that the land office is trying to remove any access that the French Métis have to even file their land claims. But it's this kind of mystery back and forth of like, do we know if he works a certain day? Do we know like where we can go find him? But again, that speaks to sort of the less overt violence, but sort of the structural systemic violence of making sure that certain demographics of people are not able to access their land or are not able to really access any government services. And so those two things always have stuck with me. Yeah, so not very happy or upbeat stories. There's not a lot happening in the 1870s.
I think history's often pretty tough stuff, so I think that you speak to that. So I was thinking a little bit about the process, and we can see sort of the visual images of the 19th century newspapers here. Do you want to talk to us about the process of doing the research with those newspapers? Like, what was the form in which you encountered them?
Yeah.
Did that change over the time you were doing your research?
Yes, yeah. So when I first started this work, some of this work I began during my master's degree, so a decade ago, and I would go at that point in time. It was easier to find some of the newspapers in the in-person archives, and so I'd be in St. Boniface digging through the big sheets of the Métis and trying to research that way. But the bulk of my research was done through digital sources, especially the University of Manitoba library system has has much of, not all, of the newspapers from Manitoba digitized. And so with the exception of a few, there's gaps, so then I had to go find those gaps in other archives, but most of it was able to be done digitized, and most of it was able to be done through the University of Manitoba library database, which was great and very helpful, especially in the pandemic when archive access became more challenging. It was great to still have access to all the digital archives. But yeah, much of the work was happening digitally, which speaks to, I guess, new methodologies available in the 2010s and 20s. Yeah.
And if you had to say, and this is a bit of a, you can say this question's a little wonky, but if you had to pick one thing you loved and one thing you really did not love about these newspapers and working with them as historical sources, what would it be?
What I loved was when I would just see little gossip columns about what's happening in people's personal lives, and just who's visiting who's fighting with who says don't shop here, they're cheating you or whatever. It was fun to get you won't find a lot of that in here. Most of what I'm dealing with is settler colonialism and the more structural violent stuff. But interspersed with all of that is just the mundanity of life that is occurring around all of these things. And so I really enjoyed finding snippets like that, like people complaining about the weather, complaining about the streets are too muddy, just things like that. So that was what I enjoyed. That was some bright spots sometimes, and also some upbeat columns in the local news. For the Free Press specifically, they played a lot with puns, they were meant to be read out loud sometimes, and so there's a lot of humor actually interspersed with a nonsensical phrase that when you read out loud, there's a bit of a joke that's there. So there's an attempt to tell jokes sometimes, which is interesting. What I did not like was, frankly, the tedious part of research, which is keeping track of all my sources and having to have all these PDFs that are organized somehow and annotated, and information organization would be the part I did not enjoy. Yeah.
Well, I have lots more questions. They kind of veer off some of them, but maybe this is now a good chance to open it up to this illustrious crowd that is gathered on a Friday night in Winnipeg, with a fair going on outside and all of that. So I'm gonna open things up, and John has a microphone here, and this is particularly important one, just so we can all hear, but also so our online friends can hear your questions.
Could you expand on what you touched on earlier with respect to potential ecological propaganda? I mean was there an effort or at least a running theme of deprecation of Indigenous land stewardship as inferior to settler efforts?
Yeah, I don't know. A big part of that is done through just omission. So, not recognizing Indigenous stewardship or knowledge when it comes to land, acting as though a settler who's been there for 5 years is the expert on what is happening in the 1870s ecology in Manitoba. So that's the most like common way that that unfolded was sort of just acting as if nobody had possibly could have any knowledge about what's happening here. And everything that we're doing right now, we've all learned from since arriving. There was a general dismissal of any sort of Indigenous knowledges for the most part. Yeah, that was sort of the most common way that looked.
Hello, I'm curious, did you find a contrast in newspapers in terms of like politics?
Yes.
And like, let's say there's one story and then out, like, and one newspaper says it this way, one newspaper, or was it kind of plain across the board?
No, I think that's a great question. Yeah, definitely the first thing. The newspapermen were competing with each other for readers, but also they had part of the reason why different newspapers kept being created was because they disagreed with the vision that the other ones had. And so they refer to each other a lot, usually not in positive terms. There's a lot of cut and paste journalism. So where one newspaper will take a story that another paper printed, tear it apart, and then add their own commentary between each paragraph. So you can really see them like fighting with each other in real time. And that was very common because they're trying to like show everybody that like you might read this paper, but here's why you're wrong, and here's all the ways that this person is bad. The biggest rivalry tended to be from the Manitoba and Northwest Herald and the Manitoba Free Press. They had the most competing vision often, as well of the English newspapers, obviously. But yeah, they're very like vehemently opposed to each other and would go so far as to like celebrate whenever anything bad happened to like Robert Cunningham, who is the editor of the Manitoban, and back and forth. So yeah, they did not agree. They fought each other all the time, and they vocally advertised their political positions. Like the newspaper that was run by the official opposition government, the Liberal Party at the time, they would that was in all their coverage. That we are opposing the government platform. So anything that the government did, they took a principled stance against it, whether or not it contradicted their own stance from the week before. They were principled in opposing the government. And so no, like the newspapers had clear points of view. No one was pretending to be neutral. That's not a thing that I encountered in the 1870s. Like journalism ethics, maybe like more of a modern development. In the 1870s, you're reading the newspaper that aligns with your perspective. So you're choosing of the 7 newspapers or whatever, you're going to choose the one that you agree with because they have very different approaches and they're very vocal about those different approaches.
You mentioned, and we're just talking about the fact that you relied a lot on newspapers.
Mm-hmm.
Nowadays, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on your point of view, a lot of people don't respect newspapers anymore. They think it's all fake news. And since you based your book on this,
Mm-hmm.
how can you reassure us that you're not relying on fake news, but real news?
Well, some of it is fake news. A lot of it is fake news. That's where having multiple newspapers speaking to the same events was actually very helpful because a lot of it is fake. That's just the reality. They would like one newspaper would report on a story that was like, oh, there was like a massacre that happened somewhere in the state. So they based on like a rumor. And then the next week they'd be like, another paper would be like, this paper reported on this massacre. We've heard no news of that. So don't believe that one, you know, or the different rumors that would be printed in the news, or so a great example of this is many of the Mennonites in the room may know when the Mennonite deputation is visited and confronted with the Métis Nation in 1872 or 1873. That gets reported on very differently within the same week. The first time that story is printed, it's violent, it's horrible, people are going to prison, there's crimes. The second or the next time that gets printed in the same week, it's like, well, maybe it was overblown. Maybe you know that was actually in danger. Like that story changes within the week, within the same paper. Just as they sort of realized that they were reporting on something that wasn't real. So that, yeah, you have, if you just read like one newspaper article, there's like no way to know if that's like the fake story or the one that was going to be real a week later or whatever. But so all that to say is there is fake news. I'm sure there's fake news in here that I've taken at face value. I've done my best to sort of read the newspapers collectively to provide like a holistic approach to that. But the gentlemen writing the news are not concerned overly with truth and accuracy. So I'm working with what I have here.
That's a rough sport.
Thank you, Adele. I have a bunch of questions, but
I've only one.
maybe, this, so Adele says this is, history is tough, right? So this, I'm a white settler colonial enough, a settler, and I guess my question is, do you think of this book in a wider context of reconciliation? And what role do you hope that it'll play in that process?
Yeah, I think of it certainly in like the truth part of truth and reconciliation. I think that's part of what I can do as a historian looking at these sources is to do my best to dig through them all and expose them, like all of the ugliness to the light. And so that people can read it and people who don't want to go digging through thousands of newspaper stories. Because I think part of the reconciliation process is to understand what we're reconciling and what the violence of settler colonialism looked like, specifically like in our context here in Manitoba, especially. Like it's important to know like the local history of a place, to know like what are the amends that need to be made, what are the crimes that were committed, what are the structures that were put in place that were sort of responsible for some of these things. So I view it as on that side of that equation, where I'm hopefully telling more of the truth of what happened here, and then people can use that hopefully to go forward and have better conversations about where we go forward, knowing what happened in the past.
Thanks, Shelisa, and congratulations on a great book. My question is about letters to the editor.
Yeah.
So I know in this period that people were allowed to submit letters under a pseudonym or alias,
Yes.
and would write all kinds of salacious and vicious gossip and stuff. So did you got to see the same people probably a lot, writing under the same names, and did you get to see particular personalities? And so that's part of my question is, like, how did you find that in your sources, and also how the editors dealt with that? Like, why did they allow anonymous comments in the comment section?
Yeah. To start with your second point first, why? I mean, it's got to be the same as today, right? Like readership, like people are going to tune into what's this guy going to say this week? What's his complaint? I feel like it must have been something to do with that, because but yes, no, there's speaking of also like building on the fake news part, there's like a real lack of a filter in these newspapers. Like they're published, like, some of the letters to the editor are outright like horrific. Well, like the one that I read that sort of excuses and encourages sexual assault. They say anything, and sometimes it appears to be just like a place for people to just like vent about like very, very petty grievances over like someone is taking too much wood from the communal wood lot and I'm going to make it everyone's problem now. And sometimes, of course, there are more serious things, right? Like that was part of like the getting to know like what the local vibe of the community was. That I thought was really interesting. At times frustrating because I just wanted to know like what actually happened, and I'm just hearing the same guy complain about his neighbor. But yeah, that was. I'm not answering your question in great detail, but yeah, that was part of the character of getting to know the newspapers, was getting to know the different characters who are just writing in all the time, and then the ones who write in relatively rarely and are like, there were also really thoughtful ones. Like there was a really interesting letter to the editor that was complaining about how I think it was Anglican Church missionary pamphlets were portraying the local Métis congregation as if they were like an unreached people who needed all this charity. And this was written from like a Métis congregant who was saying like, we can support our own churches. Like I don't want to be, we shouldn't be treated like we're uncivilized by our own churches, which was an interesting sort of pushback on like missionary propaganda from the 1870s. And that was a really thoughtful letter to the editor that was like provided, I think, some really helpful insights there. So there was thoughtful ones, there's really good ones, and then there was complaining ones.
Thanks for writing this, Shelisa. I'm really excited to read it. You mentioned right off the hop kind of the spark of interest that sort of started you on this topic. And I think you shown in your comments sort of how newspapers as a source material kind of reveals some of those themes that were of interest to you. But I'm curious, was there, as a researcher, was there like a point where you sort of in whenever it was, where you realized that this could be a type of body of sources that could maybe help tell a bit of that story that you were initially interested in, you know, or maybe there wasn't? Did you kind of approach this body of sources with maybe a hypothesis or an idea that they could be a way to get into these themes, or what did that sort of look like as a researcher?
Yeah, I feel like I stumbled into it because when I started this research, I was really trying to find information about the 1870s, and I kept running into walls of just not being able to find much in secondary literature, and I was really trying to like fill in all these gaps in my knowledge that I had. And that led me to try to figure out like what would be good primary sources from this period to try to like fill in some just the lack of knowledge that I had about this period, and it felt like many other people also had about this period. And that's when I stumbled upon all these different newspapers. So this would be like towards the beginning of my MA. And that's when I realized that, well, there had not been a ton written and published about the 1870s. There were all of these newspapers, many of which were digitized and accessible to me. And they were just there, and they could tell some of the story to fill in some of the gaps that I had. So I didn't intend to say to focus on newspapers, but it became sort of the best avenue that I had to tackle a decade that felt challenging to try to understand otherwise, just because I was trying to piece together from literature that didn't quite feel like it was developed enough to fill in all the gaps. Yeah, questions.
I know the focus of this book is about Manitoba and Manitoba newspapers, but I'm wondering if in your research you ever looked into or came across any newspapers from like Ontario or like North Dakota, like they differ significantly from like Manitoba perspective.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I kept the focus pretty succinct, mostly because that was the scope of my MA and PhD work. But those newspapers were often, newspapers from outside of Manitoba were often quoted in the same style of cut and paste journalism that they quote, that the Manitoba newspapers engaged in with each other. They also engaged in with papers from Manitoba or Quebec or different parts of the United States. So I mostly encountered them, and sometimes they would just print them directly. They would be like from the Montreal Gazette. Just be an article. Sometimes there's commentary, sometimes there's not. So, but basically, they only would publish those when they were talking about Manitoba or about an issue relating to Manitoba. So I engaged with some of those newspapers, but only as they appeared in Manitoba newspapers, just to keep the focus really narrow.
A question.
So I was reading and I think I noticed that part in your book where you said there was often short stories on the front pages of the papers. I was wondering if you had found anything else notable about the way the papers were structured back then that might have contributed to the narrative you're talking about.
Yeah, a pretty common pattern was the first page would often be depending on the year, some of the patterns change over time. But like a fictionalized like short story or like a periodical that was going to be kind of published week after week. I think as a way to like draw people in, like you want to catch the concluding ending of this short story. And then page 2 would be sort of like the local, like there'd be like local news, and then there'd be a part for sort of more national or international news depending on the paper, and just advertisements sprinkled throughout. And then court proceedings would often I think be later on, maybe like in the final pages, and more like dense stuff like that. But it was yeah, the general pattern was that like as I looked through more and more newspapers, you start to kind of sense like, okay, in this couple of year period, I know that like the local news is going to be on this page in this column, which helps make research faster, to know sort of where the local news is going to be located, because I wasn't overly concerned with the other parts of the paper, although some of the short stories were interesting. But mostly I was concerned with the local news, so it's easy to flip through. But I think, and part of it was also a lot of the local news, there was shorter excerpts that read almost like a social media feed, like back when Twitter was still sort of like functional. And you could get like little snippets of like headlines with like maybe like a sentence or two of what's happening. And then like the bigger story would be like in the following pages. So sort of like a way to like, if you were just glancing at the newspaper, you could turn to that column and sort of see what some of the main stories were. And then you could go like read further and get more detail. So that was an interesting layout choice that I thought was interesting and helpful. And that's often where the jokes were. The jokes were sort of interspersed between those sentences. Again, it really functioned like a social media feed. It really reminded me a lot of just like how people get their news today in a lot of ways. Like, because you could just read that and then get like the gist of articles without ever reading through to get the details. Yeah.
I probably could have asked you this while working on the thing, but I'm curious if you can talk a little bit more. You mentioned like sort of the unique situation of having several newspapers operating in the time that you're talking about. I'm quite familiar with the Nor'wester, which is what 1859 to 69 thereabouts. And is the Cunningham that you're talking about the same guy that was?
I think that's the same guy.
I think I'm a different guy. Maybe brother. I don't know. Anyways, just like can you talk about sort of how that like the first printing press in the West is for the Nor'wester and it's there for 10 years, and then all of a sudden you're looking at the next period, the next decade, and you have a whole wealth of papers to. Can you just talk about that sort of growth? And
Yeah.
It was a quick expansion.
Yes. Yeah, the newspaper market grows incredibly quickly. And I think part of it has to do with, I think after the Red River Resistance, there was a lot of eyes on Manitoba and a lot of people wanting to know what's happening here. And for a while, there's like, as part of the Red River Resistance and the violence that occurs after, like a newspaper press is destroyed. The New Nation, which is the real paper that is published kind of to be his government mouthpiece, that paper is destroyed in a violent sort of attack. And then when that press is then replaced, then it becomes Métis and sort of starts publishing again. But the newspapers were an incredibly valuable tool, right, of propaganda, of empire, and just that's the way people know what's happening in a given space. So I think, I mean, I can't speak to necessarily why all of the newspapers start publishing, but I think there's like a real eyes on Manitoba thing, because a lot of the newspapers initially don't have very large readership in Manitoba. They sort of know that they're publishing for an outside audience, that they're publishing to be read in Ontario, they're publishing to be read in the United States, maybe in Britain, that they know that the people who are going to be reading about Manitoba are maybe going to be making choices about potentially immigrating or just reading it for like the thrill of it because a very like exciting thing had happened in Manitoba. And so they're very aware of like the outside eyes on them. So I think a lot of it just comes from like that helps kind of spur a lot of markets. But then also Manitoba becomes what is called a newspaper graveyard for a while because they keep starting presses that then fail and then having to go. So there's a lot of very like short-lived presses. They don't all live very long. It becomes one of those places that has like just a lot of startups that can't kind of make it past the first year or two during this period because there's not that big of a reader base necessarily. So yeah, the newspaper dynamics are interesting in that sense.
So wonderful work and looking forward to the next one. I just wanted to ask, you note in the beginning, I think, that for every article that you do cite, there's 5 or 6 that, you know, were left out. I was wondering if there's any sort of pet stories or through lines that you had that were left on the cutting room floor, or that they're like the honorable mentions, or do you feel like you said everything that you wanted to succinctly?
I think I managed to keep all the good ones. I managed to keep all the ones that were really compelling, but there was a lot of like trying to figure out how to like, so the difference between a dissertation and a book is with a dissertation, you want to show mastery over the whole archive, and you can include lots of different examples to show sort of like the very subtle differences that only your committee will ever care about, and nobody else will. So those things don't get to make it to the book. So a lot of what I had to do when reducing word counts was just go in and like, okay, I gave 6 examples of this. This is my favorite one. This is the one that's going to stay. For the most part, those were fairly easy choices to make. Because I would just choose my favorite one, or the one that I thought was like most emblematic, or had maybe like the best quote. But yeah, a lot of it was the same story being told, or like the same pattern of stories. Like we're gonna keep. There's a bunch of different examples of like people complaining about land reserves being inconvenient for settlers. I didn't need all of the complaints. You know, some of the complaints could suffice and say that a lot of people complained. That sort of thing. But yeah, I don't think there was anything that I really didn't want to get rid of that I didn't feel like I could keep in a different spot somehow.
I just listened to you, and the word fake news was brought in. And I think it's dangerous to use that. It's not fitting really to the history of the 19th century. And I think what should, as fake news is with a good mind, differentiated between distortion and misrepresenting.
Sure.
And this distortion is intentional, and what is the word? This distortion, disinformation, and misinformation. So misinformation is basically not knowing. And I think that when you say that these papers were read in Ontario, in Ottawa, I think it is astounding. I think the Free Press today, there are few people, but I guess it's not penetrating. It's preoccupied by the big stuff. And the second question is, in what number were these 6 papers said published, and who could pay for that?
Yes, well, I have a helpful table that explains all of how the papers were or who published the paper and in what years they were running consecutively. Many of them were published by people who were already sort of wealthy and in Winnipeg, so they were already local businessmen or politicians who, I don't know how many of the papers actually made money from the beginning, I'm not sure. But it was more important, I think, for certain powerful people in the community to have an arm for their voice to be expressed within the community and away abroad from the community. So I think that was that's why there were so many, because there were so many competing interests, I think, here, right? And so many competing interests that were happening, that were all trying to make sure that their audience and that their point of view was communicated. And yeah, it's tough to know with the quote unquote fake news, what is disinformation versus what is misinformation, because the newspapers were comfortable printing lies. They were comfortable printing things they knew were false. Sometimes they also would correct themselves, sometimes they would not. And sometimes they were printing rumors, which maybe they didn't know were rumors, but there was, I think now journalists are much more ethical, I hope, and careful about those things. But at this point in time, they're really just trying to promote their given paper's agenda. So if that misinformation line is blurred a lot, I think, in 1870s Manitoba.
We do have time for one more question, if there's one out there. And if there isn't, then I'll. Do you have a final question, or do you folks have any closing comments?
Closing comments. I mean, there's so much to chew on here. And one thing that I was just thinking about, like, what do you think if you had to just pick one thing that would be the pressing question that either you or somebody else you would want to take up out of this project, what would that be?
I think what I want people to take away from this book is that the settler colonial process sometimes happens right in front of people's eyes, and it's not hidden and it's open. And historians can go back and very easily talk about it. So I think that's the thing that I wanted to. I want people who read this book, I think, to have a sense of how like these things weren't hidden or like a secret. It wasn't like the settlers moving to Manitoba didn't know what was happening around them. It was the water they were swimming in. They were very like aware of what was going on, if they were paying any attention to the paper or to just their neighbors. And so I think that's the main takeaway, was that it's not mysterious. It's not like some sort of like thing that appeared is like descended from no one knows where settler colonialism came from. We know, we were watching it happen in real time in the 1870s, and it's visible and it's obvious. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to both of you. Thank you all for your attention and your questions. We will now move along to the signing portion of the evening, which means there will be one moment of glorious chaos while some people get in line right here and extend down there. If the line does look intimidating, feel free to sit down and wait to join at your convenience. Please do feel free to come up and have a copy of the book signed before you pay for it. Just please do remember to pay for the book before you leave. Greatly appreciate it. We're so grateful to the University of Manitoba Press for printing this book and for making this evening a possibility. And I'm going to ask you to join me in 2 rounds of applause. The first is for our inimitable host, Adele Perry. And a suitably raucous round of applause for Shelisa Klassen. Thank you so much for being here. Have a very good night.